Hello, I'm Colin Gallagher, CEO at Onward and Upward, and you're listening to the Association 100 Podcast, where each week we interview association leaders from across the country to hear how they're trying new things, taking big risks, and delivering value for their members. We'll explore the realities of what it means to work in and with associations and bring you the insights and inspiration you need to advance your career and make big changes at your association. Let's get started.
Welcome back to another episode of the A100 Podcast. I'm Meghan Henning, and I'm your host for today. I'm recording on the show floor during ASAE's annual conference here in Cleveland, and I'm very excited for today's conversation. My guest today is Dr. Cie Armstead, Administrative Director, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the American College of Surgeons. Dr. Cie Armstead is the inaugural executive leader and is now the Administrative Director for Inclusive Excellence at the American College of Surgeons. She is also the founder and principal of Owl Observations, a career coaching and consulting firm. Welcome.
Thank you. I am excited to be here.
So tell us about your association.
Wow, that's an open-ended question. As indicated in its title, it is an association of more than 80,000 surgeons across the world, really. And as with all associations, member societies, we focus on serving our members, surgeons, most of them are fellows of the college, in all aspects of the profession.
So implementing DEI initiatives can come with significant challenges. What are some of the major obstacles you've encountered in your role, and how have you successfully navigated those to advance the ACS's mission of creating an inclusive environment?
One of the first challenges is embodied in that very question, and that is for the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion to be framed only as challenges. I've been doing some aspect of this work, for more than 3 decades. And I do know and appreciate that there are challenges, obstacles. However, that is only part of the story. When organizations, leaders are really committed to doing this work in a meaningful way, not just a performative way, they recognize all of the benefits that building a diverse, equitable, inclusive environment brings. And so one of the first challenges is making sure that the narrative around the topic is all-inclusive and is not just focusing on the problem side of it. Another challenge is maintaining commitment to the real work. Unfortunately, in society today, all too often, the work of DEI has been, I'm going to say, weaponized. And it makes it more complicated to talk about what it really means to focus on building diverse environments, all of the dimensions of diversity. So that's important. Every aspect, every one of us, we're diverse in some way. No, even twins are not exactly the same. And so being able to focus on what does it mean to build environments that appreciates all the dimensions of diversity, that are striving to be fair to everyone, that's equity in the simplest form, and then all-inclusive. So when we talk about what it really means and take the label off, I think most people are supportive of at least a few of those principles. But the challenge is when that label is put on there in those environments where it has been painted with a negative narrative, then some people don't stand still long enough to really appreciate what that means. And that's a challenge. One last response there, and there are many, is the challenge of allocating adequate resources. I've done this work for nearly 3 decades or longer, and I've seen so many times where well-intentioned leaders, organizations give verbal commitment to this work, but not the resource allocation.
Yes. You have literally been at the forefront then of developing and implementing these initiatives. Can you share some of the most impactful strategies you've employed to foster a more inclusive and equitable environment within the organization? Because I shouldn't have started with the negative. I should have started with the positive. So talk to me about the positives and what you have seen and done and to implement in your organization.
Okay. One of the positives is two parts, particularly when starting this work. And I've had an opportunity to start aspects of this work in three large associations and to be supportive of many others who are starting this work. And one of the positives is to take a moment, step back, and assess where your organization is right now. What's the climate for what the work will be, and identifying places where these concepts, these principles that are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion can be part of the solution so that when you start off, you're showing how, you're demonstrating how having some aspect of DEI principles are part of the solution. For example, I was working with an association and so many member groups. They wanted to focus on building their membership. They realized that their regular pool of potential members, quite frankly, were getting old, dying off. It was shrinking. So they knew that they needed to identify and tap into new pools of potential members. Some smart leader there recognized that their potential new members were much more diverse, again, in the multiple dimensions of diversity. And they connected their diversity work. And at that point, it was just diversity. Inclusion and equity hadn't been added on yet. But they connected their diversity work to membership. And so they had a member committee that focused on membership and diversity, hence the MAD committee. But what they were doing was they took the principles of diversity and applied it to an opportunity, a challenge they had, growing their membership. And so diversity came in the door as being part of the solution. And that's powerful.
That is very powerful, especially when you referenced that you want companies not to just play the lip service, because that isn't going to help. And it's obviously not genuine, and you want that within your organization. I read, I think on your website, that your approach to DEI includes listening tours and creating educational programs, which I think are amazing. How do you ensure that these efforts resonate with the diverse groups within your organization? And I guess the follow-up question would be, what advice would you give to other association professionals looking to personalize their DEI strategies so that they're not just having lip service?
Whew, that's an open-ended question. And let me see if I can attack both of those, address, not attack. Definitely the personalization. Personalization to the organization. When we say DEI, that is large. That could mean so many different things. And I've seen too often where organizations don't take the time to customize it to what their needs are, or to customize it to align with their mission, their objectives. And they pull something off the shelf and try to apply it in their organization without that customization. And it doesn't go over too well. So part of what you referenced, my listening tour, when I started in my organization where I am now, and we were just standing up the Office of DEI at that time. And so I was new to this environment, and I wanted to take a quick snapshot, a pulse, and listen to all levels throughout the organization so I could identify potential areas where DEI principles could be an asset, could become part of the solution. I wanted to gain an understanding of where potential challenges might be. I wanted to identify likely allies and then maybe a few adversaries so that, one, I can better then set a realistic strategy. I would encourage any organization that's either starting this work or looking to enhance it to step back a moment and really see what's going to be specific to your organization that's going to yield returns, that's going to make a difference to relevant stakeholders. And so certainly the board, the leadership, those are relevant stakeholders, and also the rank and file. Those are relevant stakeholders. And just remember, you cannot do everything all at once. And so oftentimes, the biggest challenge is after doing a listening tour, seeing all the many places you can invest your time and your energy and your resources, making the decisions on where will we start? Where will we start for what the low-hanging fruit to have some early wins? Where will we plant some seeds knowing that we're not going to have immediate returns, but we're investing in the work. And then eventually, probably not right at the start, doing some long-term work where we may not see a return for 5, 7 years. That's the hardest part. But for me, is the people side of it. That's why the customization is so important, not only to the organization, but customizing it to your key stakeholders. Because ultimately, the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's about people.
I even love the title of it, like a listening tour. Most people are on a talking tour. You're talking about it, but this resonated with me where you think you're going out and you are going to listen to the people in your organization and the people that you want to give their best to the organization, and how best to do that other than to listen. So I really like that. The ACS has a long-standing commitment to DEI with initiatives dating back to the mid-20th century. How do you balance honoring those historical efforts while pushing for what needs to happen today?
The American College of Surgeons does have that long positive history and also some unfavorable history. Like so many national associations that have been around decades, there are some, let's say, skeletons in the closet. Times when certain types of, in this case, surgeons, but other organizations too, they didn't allow certain members to join and certainly not to be active. Again, early in my tenure, I met with the archivists at the American College of Surgeons, and we created a history of diversity at the organization. Again, some of it not so favorable, but that's part of understanding the stories. And fortunately, shortly before I came, there had been a book that was compiled by one of the surgeons on the history of Black surgeons in the profession. And that served as a source for me and also part of us building this very visible history of diversity in the organization, which we made public because we did want to acknowledge both the good and not so good, the real picture of the history. That's the platform, that's the foundation. And then we had part of that history, I believe it was, I want to say around the turn of the century to that the organization had its first formal diversity statement. And that was great to see, as well as that it had been updated a few times since then. Part of the reason that was so important was that when I came aboard, it was a result of the murder of George Floyd and the increased interest in diversity and inclusion at that time. But we wanted to show that the college was not just jumping aboard the bandwagon, that there had been significant work that was done, but there was still much work to do. So you ask, how do we acknowledge the history and build moving forward? And the colleges, the American College of Surgeons, they were positioned to do that by investing in building this Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, adding the resources, meaning staff, and a budget, so that we can then look at where are the needs now, both for the member side, our surgeons, as well as our 400-plus staff. We have parallel tracks where we address DEI opportunities on both sides of our equation, members and staff. So it is a balance, but it's a work that the organization is committed to.
That's great. Looking forward, what are some emerging trends or areas of focus in DEI that you believe will be critical for the healthcare sector and associations like the American College of Surgeons to address in the coming years?
So I'm going to respond to that briefly again in those two areas on the staff side and the member side. In healthcare, one of the common trends is not an emerging trend, it's been around for decades, but it's still very relevant, and that is health equity. When just about any area of healthcare, there are disparities that can continue to persist and in some cases are getting worse. So that's an area that despite the pushback on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I choose to believe that work is going to continue because it is so prevalent. Again, in any area of medicine, you see the disparities, and there are disparities that don't have to exist. And so I choose to believe that the focus on health equity will continue. Another area is representation, and it is tied oftentimes to health equity, that having more diverse, whatever aspect of diversity we're talking about, having more diverse representation, research shows tends to improve those inequities. And I'm speaking very generally, but there's much research there that supports the importance of representation in order to address health inequities. On the staff side, from an association management perspective, trends, and I started to label it as unfortunate, but I'm going to take an optimistic perspective, and that is on the resistance, the pushback to, again, that label of DEI. And it is creating some unnecessary headwinds. It is resulting in some financial cuts, especially when some members are vocalizing their pushback, and when it comes time for budget considerations, the diversity, equity, and inclusion sometimes ends up on the cutting floor. But I'm going to say, and I have to believe this, that pushback, that resistance is also helping those organizations that were sincerely committed to this work. They are reinforcing their commitment, and I've seen it. I've seen it in my organization, American College of Surgeons. I've seen it and heard of it in other associations. They are reinforcing their commitment to this work, even in those geographical areas where they may no longer legally be able to say DEI. They are finding ways to stay committed to this work. So this resistance, this pushback is elevating the topic in a way that will separate those who were serious and have been committed and those who jumped on the bandwagon in 2020 but never really fully invested in the work.
That is so true. In closing, for our listeners who want to personalize and make this something that they are putting their time and money behind, what's one thing that they could do tomorrow?
One thing out of many. I would prioritizing having someone who is committed to this work, who has the experience and or the expertise in doing this work. Unfortunately, I've seen this from more than 3 decades ago, and it's still true, that well-intentioned leaders make the commitment they're going to do something in this area, and they identify someone based on their social identity and say, would you like to do this work? And that person may be passionate, they may have lived experiences that would encourage them to do this work, but they don't have the experience or the expertise in this profession. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a discipline. I liken it to the fact that because I have teeth, I can be a dentist. That's crazy, right? That is not logical. The one thing I would say is if you as an organization or you as someone who's interested in this work and you want to do it, invest in really learning the profession. You're not going to be an expert overnight, but take it seriously. It is a discipline and there's skills that are necessary to do it effectively.
I think that's a great reminder, too, that it is a discipline and it's a skill and it's not just a wish, right? That some companies might think of it that way. So this is great. I think this was an important conversation, and I'm hopeful that this is an important conversation that associations are still having. So we close out each podcast with a just for fun portion so our listeners can get to know you. So I will ask you a couple questions. Where did you grow up?
It depends. I was born and raised in Chicago for the most part with a serious Southern influence. Some say I have a Southern accent. My family on both my mother and father's side are from around Memphis. And then my husband, who I met in Chicago, he is also from around Memphis. So Chicago with serious Southern influence.
Okay, I like it because I can hear the Southern accent, so I thought you were going to say something way more south than Chicago. What's your Starbucks order?
That question is based on an assumption.
It very much is. No
I
Starbucks for
consider
you?
myself a recovering Starbucks addict. I gave up caffeine twice, but I do go to Starbucks. They have a great green juice.
Okay. If you won the lottery tomorrow, would you still work?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned my firm observations. I would do that full time and give away all my services.
That's great. What's the last show you either binged watched or just watched and liked?
Oh, gosh, true confession. So that question is based on an assumption.
Yes.
And I will confess, the one that I'm hooked on right now is The Resident.
Yes. Very good show. I like the people in that too. What is a food you cannot live without?
Popcorn.
Love it. What's your bucket list travel destination?
I love to travel, so I'm trying to distill which ones want to go to another country in Africa. I've been to South Africa, but want to visit at least a few more countries in Africa. Australia. Always go to islands. I want to make every island. I love warm weather.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today with our listeners, and we really appreciate you joining the A100 today.
Thank you for this opportunity.
That's a wrap for today's episode. The Association 100 Podcast is a production of Onward and Upward Marketing and Communications, where our mission is to make associations and nonprofits the go-to source in their industries through earned media and thought leadership. This podcast is an extension of the A100 newsletter, a bi-monthly collection of best practices, top trends, helpful ideas, and smart strategies delivered straight to your inbox. Have you undertaken a big change at your association, or do you have some words of wisdom for the trenches of association life? We want to hear from you, and so do our listeners. Drop us a note at info@onwardupward.com. That's info@onwardupward.com. If you like what you heard today, be sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share with your friends and colleagues. We're available anywhere podcasts are found. Come back next week for more association inspiration and insights. Thanks for tuning in.